I would defy anyone to sort of explain why it is that China decided to move away from wolf warrior diplomacy, other than to say that I think it became apparent to Xi that the wolf warrior diplomacy was failing. And to their pleasure, I guess, is what's happened is that they got a more compliant Australian government. So they've played us in a more sophisticated way. And I think our government has pretty much eaten it up and is delighted with what they think is an achievement of their own diplomatic skill.
Peter Jennings, thanks so much for joining us at the IPA today to discuss very important issues of national security and defence in the week following the Prime Minister's historic visit to China, a 6-day visit at which certain issues were discussed and certain issues were not discussed. So thanks for coming into the IPA, as I say.
Thank you, Scott.
And that is very much the Australian dilemma, that our major security partner is the USA, our major trading partner is China, and we've been managing that tension now for a couple of decades on the assumption, it's been a bipartisan consensus, that we do not have to choose between our security needs and our trading needs. That, up until now, has been the consensus, but the Prime Minister has not been to see Donald Trump, but he has been to see Xi Jinping on a 6-day love fest. Have we just made a choice?
Well, it's a great question, and I think we are indeed beginning to see below the radar shift in Australian foreign policy priorities. Don't base that on what the government says, base it on what the Prime Minister's done. That lengthy trip to China, his bizarre refusal to reach out to the President of the United States, in fact, the refusal of the whole cabinet really to engage with the Americans substantively. And I begin to wonder if this doesn't actually reflect a shift in priority, which kind of happened almost by accident as a result of Labor's astonishingly successful win in the election. And what I mean by that is Albanese got some value, so he thinks, by being critical of Peter Dutton for being Timu Trump a little too close to the Americans. The government is re-elected with a much larger majority than they were expecting. And I wonder if that doesn't leave Albanese thinking to himself that there's political benefit now in putting more distance between Australia and the United States and, reverting to some of his far left ideology as a student and in his early political years, getting close to China in the footsteps of his hero, Gough Whitlam. So,
well, literally in the footsteps by walking along the Great Wall of China. This is not just as a tourist, this is explicitly a callback to Gough Whitlam's visit.
Exactly. And so I think this is going to present quite a challenge to the opposition because in between, the disastrous election loss, they now have to ask themselves the question, is Labor quietly breaking the bipartisan deal on Australian security policy? And if so, what are they going to do about it?
So let's stay on that point for a moment, because what you're implying there, Peter, I think not unreasonably, is that this is perhaps the direction that the Albanese himself and the Albanese government might have wanted to go to in its first term. We certainly saw, though, that they still felt the need to pay at least lip service to the US alliance. They felt wedged on AUKUS. They felt, even though the coalition had introduced the AUKUS agreement under Scott Morrison, that they were obligated to follow through on it and appear to be doing so. But now, as you say, with that election win behind them, and one of the commentators on the weekend, I think it might have been Paul Kelly, who said, yes, it does appear that their assessment now is that they do not pay a political price for seeing to be walking back from the US alliance. So that is essentially what you're saying.
Yes, and that represents quite a shift in Australian popular thinking about defence and security too. I think Labor has always been a little bit scared to be painted as weak on security, and the result of that is that, Labor governments of a past generation, I'm thinking of Bob Hawke and Kim Beazley, worked really hard to sort of craft a Labor position on the alliance which was comfortable for the party and which everyone could support. But that's clearly not where Albanese comes from, and it's not where Penny Wong comes from. And I do think that they now believe that that there is some political benefit for them to be more distanced from the United States. And let's be frank, that really means Donald Trump. They were happy enough to be close to the Biden administration, but then the Biden administration wasn't asking, it would seem, too much of Australia. Then the other thing which I think is relevant here is that the government has, after 3 years in power, got a better sense of the real cost of AUKUS. So AUKUS, for our listeners, of course, Scott, is the nuclear-powered submarine deal and a plan for a sort of a range of other high-tech initiatives beyond that. And it's all great in theory, but it is incredibly expensive. And I think the government realises that they can't, they can have AUKUS or they can have the current Australian Defence Force for about 2% of gross domestic product, but they can't have both. And so would Albanese be that unhappy if Donald Trump decided to sort of pull the AUKUS rug out from underneath Australia's participation? I just think that Albanese might be positioning for that type of eventuality.
Peter, this is an unprecedented bit of analysis coming to you live from the IPA. I just want to go back a step, because this dilemma that at our current trajectory of Australian defence spending, which has hovered around the 2% mark, and in the work that you and your co-authors did for the IPA publication, No Higher Priority, available now on all good bookstores and on the IPA website, you identified this dilemma, that there were very good reasons for Australia to invest in its military capabilities, not just to keep faith with the Americans, but in our own national interest.
Yeah, first and foremost.
First and foremost in our own national interest. And that to do so, we would need to increase our expenditure. And this has just been confirmed in a paper by a former advisor to George Bush, Evan Feigenbaum, for the Carnegie Endowment, who said, and I quote, "Australia under its current budget cannot afford both the full scope of investments envisaged under AUKUS and the other needed investments in conventional capabilities." So that is echoing our analysis and echoing what any fair-minded person would say. You can't do this on the cheap. But you're actually saying that this dilemma is well understood by Albanese, and the solution is actually to throw AUKUS under the bus.
I think that's a possibility that we should now contemplate. And my reason for saying that is the government's had 3 years. It's actually had the vast bulk of the time that AUKUS has been in existence to steer that project and to get an ever more precise sense of the cost of the program, which is enormous. We're talking about ultimately constructing nuclear-powered submarines in Australia, one of the most technically complex pieces of equipment designed by humankind, off the back of a very limited industrial base, which means to say that there has to be huge investment to make that happen. We have to build a new port for those nuclear submarines on the east coast of the country, because our Navy bases are just not big enough to take the subs and all the other pieces of equipment planned long term. We have to build a nuclear storage facility for those reactors once they're spent and done. We have to train thousands and thousands of people, not only to be in the Navy, but to be in industry to support this capability. All of this is on the government's current plan coming out of the existing defence budget.
And which is completely unsustainable.
Unsustainable.
And to stick with your analysis, this is a completely different way of looking at things. So the point you made, have been making about AUKUS, is that of course there's a risk that for some reason it doesn't get delivered, that the submarines don't get delivered. And the appropriate way to think about that is well, what are some of the risk mitigation measures? And most notably, one of the 36 recommendations of No Higher Priority was the purchase of the long-range B-1 bombers, which I must say looks like a very good call in the wake of the incredible role that the B-1 bombers played in the recent strike on Iran.
Yes.
But again, that's risk mitigation. That's not saying that we are going to pursue the end of AUKUS as an outcome.
Well, what led myself and my colleagues, Michael Shoebridge and Marcus Hellier, down this path was we asked ourselves the question, so what if the AUKUS submarines can't be delivered?
Or can't be delivered on time.
Or on time. And you know, there's a bunch of factors that could explain that. One might be that Australia isn't serious enough, we don't spend the money. Another is that the Americans decide they'd rather have the technology for themselves. There is only one other country in the world that the US has actually handed nuclear propulsion technology to. That was the British 60 odd years ago. So they guard this very closely. And for a whole bunch of reasons, you know, it may well be that one side or the other concludes it's too expensive and too dangerous. So what else can we do? Now, our solution, which we write about in the book, is to say, well, there's this new aircraft called the B-21 strike bomber, which is currently beginning to roll off American production lines. There's about 5 in production right now. It's going to go into American service in 2026 or 2027. Now, we know how to operate long-range strike aircraft. We've done it before. We had the F-111 for decades, the only other country other than the US to operate the F-111. So here's an alternate way to think about how we might structure the force. In saying that, you know, I'm a fan of submarines. Scott, you know, one of my speech jokes is to say
it would be nice to have some.
I've never met a submarine I didn't like, and I would be more than happy to see them. But I think we do have to ask ourselves some practical questions now. Are we going to? Our government doesn't strike me as that serious. They clearly don't want to spend the money. The Americans, I think, are worried about whether or not Australia is up to the task. So I could see how this could all just sort of fall away pretty quickly.
Well, let's come back then, though, to where we started. So here we are, potentially witnessing, and I think it says in the Bible, judge them by their deeds. So there hasn't been any great national security speech by Prime Minister Albanese, nor by Penny Wong, nor by Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles, but by their deeds, by what Albanese has done in China. So you're saying there is every sign of a drastic negative change to the US alliance, which has been in place, you know, de facto since World War II, and by treaty since the Menzies government implemented in the 1950s. There's dramatic change. But this was not announced in Washington. This was not the subject of bilateral meetings between the Prime Minister and the US government about this is where we are going, this is our view of the alliance. We've essentially had this broadcast from the Great Hall of the People.
Yes, that's exactly right. But, you know, it's clear that the tone has changed quite markedly, say from, you know, the halfway point of the government's first term to where they're at now. And I think one of the most disturbing things to note, Scott, is that faced with this so-called internal review in the Pentagon into AUKUS, which everyone is supposedly meant to be very worried about, if the Australian government wanted AUKUS to continue, don't you think they'd be putting more of an effort in to try and shape that review? So we know that Albanese doesn't want to go to Washington, D.C. He doesn't want to be put in the Oval Office hot seat for a potentially a disastrous meeting. But why hasn't Richard Marles gone to talk to Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defence? You wouldn't send Penny Wong because Penny Wong's not in the business of building submarines or planning to build submarines. But there should have been a much more serious Australian effort to get inside the loop and to sort of say to the Americans, no, we're serious, you can trust us. Instead of which we're doing what the Albanese government does so often, which is we're kind of sitting back and being a spectator at our own parade, waiting for the Americans to bring down the judgment from the mount. And in some respects, I think we're being, we're sort of playing for our worst expectations of each other. So, you know, the American worst expectation of Australia is that we're not serious and we're not going to pull our weight. Our worst expectation of the Trump administration is that they're going to be America first and they're not serious about allies. And by virtue of the fact that we're not talking to each other, we may well produce that expectation as an outcome.
The absolute lose-lose outcome. So this is my concern about Pete Hegseth. who is certainly an activist Secretary of Defence, but not an experienced one, not someone who comes out of the establishment. And in burnishing his America First credentials, a lot of the noise that comes out of the review is like, are the Australians going to pull their weight? Are they going to pay for this? Are they paying enough for this? If they build the submarines, are they going to be on our side in the event of any conflict with China over Taiwan? We're not entirely sure whether he actually means like literally deployed or just, whose side are you on? So he is sending these messages, and my concern is that he's misreading the Albanese government, that these kind of things are exactly what they would need to use as an excuse to say, well, we're not going to be pushed around. That's not how we roll. And as wise people have said, you also don't prejudge military commitments like hypotheticals over Taiwan. But Hesketh, I worry, might stumble into this and give them exactly the excuse that they need to walk away from it.
Yeah. I mean, if you said to me, Peter, please write a strategy for how we could produce a disaster with AUKUS, I'd be doing pretty much what both governments are doing right now. And that's a concern. And, for Australia, what we need to reflect on here is not so much the abruptness of how the Trump administration deals with allies, but more the consequence of the administration saying, well, we're just not going to have as close a relationship with you. I mean, how do we benefit from that? It frankly is a disaster in terms of our position in a region where China is becoming, more and more of a dominant bullying power. We need the United States as much as John Curtin needed the United States back in 1942, which is a realization that, Anthony Albanese seems to be so ideologically driven by that he can't now assess the level of risks. And it's all being smothered in this sort of language of sovereign independence. Well, we can be sovereign and independent as a country of 25 million people, and we're not really going to be able to look after our security in that world. No,
we won't. And because what we're actually talking about is different scenarios, and these can be scenarios short of outright war, in which China becomes hegemonic in the Asia-Pacific region. And that is not a benign environment for Australia. We've certainly seen if you're, the Philippines or Japan or Taiwan, obviously, that when China is asserting its authority, it's not a very pleasant experience. No. But this doesn't seem to be factored into the scenarios in which we embrace China and allow the US to be pushed to the side. And again, our recommendations for building up our military is not about the pursuit of the alliance. It's about our capacity to defend our own interests.
Defend our own interests and also create a deterrent effect. Because really the purpose of the investment is to try to persuade China, and frankly, this is what it's about. It's not about any other country. It's to try to persuade China that it's not worth it today to go to war over Taiwan or the South China Sea or any other issue. And I think that's another level of cause to be concerned about the current state of Australia-US relations, because whilst our government is saying, in a sense quite rightly, well, we're not going to pre-commit to a conflict with Taiwan, what we are failing to say is how we will work together with our allies to create a strong defence force. And China, it's just not worth even thinking about engaging in a military attack. Yeah. So, this current line of rhetoric about sovereign independence, there's one country that would be delighted about it, and that's China, because they will see us coming out as a weaker ally of the United States. And really, that's what they've set out to achieve. They want America's allies to be weaker, to be less committed to the idea of collective defence in the Indo-Pacific region. So it's hardly surprising that Xi Jinping says he changes his schedule so he can have a private lunch with Albanese on that 6-day trip. We're delivering exactly what Xi Jinping actually wants right now.
Well, this is one of the things that sometimes in diplomacy, and such negotiations, you might say, various concessions are dearly bought. But I would have thought, the 8-course menu on that lunch was one of the cheapest investments China's ever had to make. And I think we should spend a moment on the optics of the trip. And for me, it was epitomised by when Albanese, the Prime Minister, did raise at some point the small matter of a flotilla of Chinese warships circumnavigating Australia, more or less in the middle of a federal election campaign, engaging in live fire exercises. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in the Tasman Sea.
Yes.
And Albanese raised this in the gentlest possible way, which was simply, we would have liked a little bit more notice, and was still rebuffed.
Yes.
Not even that.
Absolutely. I mean, Xi Jinping's response was to say, hey, we'll exercise wherever we choose to. Full stop. There wasn't much in the way of negotiation being entered into on that. And I just find it quite remarkable that our Prime Minister, continues to effectively defend that Chinese operation and say completely inaccurately, well, we do similar things in the South China Sea. Now, let me be clear about this. We don't. We do not engage in unilateral missile firings under civilian aircraft flight paths, which is what the Chinese do. We do not refuse to advise our neighbours of what it is we're actually doing when we exercise. And we do not go after other ships and aircraft in the region as aggressively as we can with lasers and fire hoses and all of those sorts of things to try and cause them destruction. They are all practices that the PLA Navy engages in. So why do we have a situation where our Prime Minister is not even just going quiet about what China did, but defending their very bad behaviour?
Going at great pains to explain to the assembled journalists that I was in international waters.
Yes. So I think if you'd said to me 10 years ago, what would be the sort of dream Chinese goal for achieving its policy objectives in Australia, I would have said, well, they would like to weaken the alliance relationship with the United States. They'd like Australia economically to be more dependent on China. They'd like our defence force to be weaker. And they'd like the Australian government to be as deferential as it possibly can to Beijing. And all four of those things have been achieved, Scott. Not necessarily by the Chinese, they've been achieved by us. I mean, they've been achieved by this government deciding what its priorities are going to be and how they think they can manage the Chinese relationship. So, subtly, this is a change which I think Australians now need to understand is quite fundamental to how Australian governments approach foreign policy and defence policy. And we have to watch very carefully to see where they now go from here.
What I think we should spend a moment on, and Scott Morrison was recently in the news, and I think he actually did this quite succinctly, and it's this was the front page of the Weekend Australian on Saturday. He was at pains to point out something which I don't think needs to be pointed out to you, your good self or anyone who takes this business seriously, that obviously the optics of Xi Jinping talking to Australia have changed dramatically over the last 5 or 6 years. But what does not change is their objectives. One of the advantages of being a one-party state with complete control of civil society and the media and a Politburo and now a leader with unprecedented or certainly since the time of Mao, unprecedented levels of personal authority, is there is a consistency of objectives. So Morrison's point is simply that they had a strategy of bullying Australia in the time of Turnbull and then Morrison. It was to Turnbull's great credit that he resisted that bullying. I think it helped that he took it personally, because anything that impacts Malcolm personally he's going to do something about. Similarly, Morrison did not concede and famously said that there should be an inquiry into the origins of COVID, which led to great upset in China, but it was also a range of strategic issues. So Morrison said, China's plan back then was to isolate us from the US by bullying us. Their plan now is to isolate us from the US by charming and flattering us. So the objectives are consistent. The only thing that's changed is tactics.
Yes, yes, yes. That's a nice way of putting it. And I mean, our government would maintain that we're back into the trade relationship with China because of the sophistication of Australian diplomacy, and the fact that we have what they now call a stabilised relationship. In fact, I would defy anyone to sort of explain why it is that China decided to move away from wolf warrior diplomacy of a few years ago, which was the very aggressive, sometimes confrontational language that was used to kind of push a more assertive China on the global stage. Why did they back away from that to come back to a bit more of the charm offensive? Well, I mean, the answer is it's very hard to get into understand the minds of senior Chinese leaders in Beijing because these things are not debated or discussed. Other than to say that I think it became apparent to Xi that that wolf warrior diplomacy was failing. That in fact China was losing friends in Europe and amongst the developed democracies, and so they wound that back a bit. And to their pleasure, I guess, is what's happened is that they got, a more compliant Australian government that wanted to sort of share in the success of those sanctions being removed on different exports, and so it's worked for China in a way that the bullying did not. And probably the bullying would not have worked against any Australian government, including the Albanese government. So they've played us in a more sophisticated way. And I think our government has pretty much eaten it up and is delighted with what they think is an achievement of their own diplomatic skill.
That is nicely put. And so I think we do need to focus on the personal dimension of this. Loath as I am to personalise it to Mr. Albanese, there's a couple of things that happened on that trip, which do really give me cause for concern. Because you could hypothetically build a scenario. You've been in the councils of the great, Peter, where very hard-minded people are making realistic assessments, and perhaps in the ALP's cabinet room, it's simply like, oh, well, we need to do what's in our economic interests. But that last thing you said about they've actually been eating this up, to me, the smoking gun was the speech that the Prime Minister made, one of the many speeches he made, where he talked about he wanted to see more tourism in China. Well, first of all, he said he wanted to see more foreign direct investment by Australia in China. Now, that's been cratering for the obvious reason that, if you put your money into China, we've now discovered you can't actually get it back out again. You put your executives into China, they can finish up in jail, as we saw with Stern Hu and various journalists. There are many, many good reasons not to invest in China.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, Mr. Albanese said that he wanted to see more Australian investment in China. He also said he wanted to see more tourism in China, and which is, in a funny sort of way, just to digress for a moment, so do I in a way. I went to China a few times under my own steam, and then the China-Australia Chamber of Commerce, sponsored by Huawei, took me there on a delegation in 2018, and I came back. I'd left being interested in what was going on in China and came back terrified. Yeah. So maybe there's a point. But the Albanese said, I want more Australians to visit and get, quote, the same welcome that I have had during my 8 visits to China. I mean, what does that tell you about the level of naivety that the Prime Minister is operating under?
I mean, I must say there were several cringeworthy moments on this trip. One was where Albanese said that he'd noticed that the Chinese military band playing at the banquet was playing Midnight Oil's tunes, and that this was a great compliment to the people of Australia, and that the fact that his partner Jody had been invited, well, that too was a great compliment to the people of Australia, and it is true to say that the Chinese do put a great deal of store into this sort of protocol type of arrangement. But every minute that the Prime Minister was being forced to listen to a PLA band Murder and Oil's tune was a minute that he didn't have to talk to them about strategy or otherwise engage in the substance.
Human rights or live fire exercises.
Or, cyber espionage, you name it. And really, I think one thing that Albanese does have in common with Xi Jinping is that they both didn't want to deal with substance on this trip. And that's why it ended up looking like a pretty empty case of, visiting the Great Wall, a tennis match, which of course the Prime Minister loves, lots of banquets and dinners. The formalities of meetings being filmed for the first minute or two, and then the cameras kind of leave the room.
And Australian journalists literally unable to go into, observe some of the meetings.
Yes, exactly. And so it was largely substance free, and I think that's what the Prime Minister wanted. And, I do wonder to myself if it is always possible when you get to those top levels of government that you begin to believe your own press releases. And, maybe it's the case that he thinks that a visit of that nature is genuinely
maybe he
valuable.
Actually thinks that he is seeing China.
Yeah.
Maybe he thinks that's what China is. It's not re-education camps in Xinjiang.
Indeed, but one of the things I did was I checked to see, right, well, who had what world leaders had Xi Jinping met in the previous 8 weeks or so before Albanese went to Beijing, and the answer was many Central Asian leaders from Africa, leaders from the Middle East, New Zealand Prime Minister
and Lavrov from Russia.
I mean, this is, so much of the world going to Beijing to sort of, pay respects and pay due deference to the great power. It would frankly be a mistake to think that Xi spends that much time thinking about Australia. And he doesn't have to now, because Australia's not preventing, not giving him any complicated challenges to have to manage. So I thought it was a great shame that the visit was so light on for substance. I think the Prime Minister actually probably did take some damage to the extent that people pay attention to these things for being there for 6 days. He could have cut out the Great Wall and the pandas and gone to Tokyo for a day to talk about our growing defence relationship with Japan. He could have cut out another day and gone to Seoul to talk about our increasing defence and security and economic relationship with South Korea. But no, it was a sort of a grand tour, and one that, whether he realised it or not, was kind of putting him in the position of being the supplicant, the minor sort of regional power going to kowtow at the Emperor's Palace, which was great for what the Chinese wanted for their domestic media.
Yes.
But I think a very bad place for the Australian Prime Minister to put himself in.
And again, we come back to the point that while this is going on, there isn't a conversation going on with the USA. And I just wanted to come back to what it looks like from the American perspective, and Hesketh and Trump and J.D. Vance. They have continued on a strategy which they first unveiled in Trump's first term of beating up on the Europeans to increase their defence expenditure in what was seen as very undiplomatic terms when it was first unveiled in 2017. But we're now seeing results from that, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing significant pledges to increase defence spending in Europe. This is something that successive American presidents, really going back to George Bush, George W., have been arguing that the Europeans should do more and spend more. I think the Europeans have finally been goaded into that situation, one, because of the Russians,
yes,
but two, because of the very, very direct, no-nonsense kind of diplomacy that comes from Trump and from his senior team. It may not be pretty, but it has had the effect of many NATO countries Spain being one of the exceptions, which are saying, yep, we're now on track to spend something like 5% of GDP on a combination of defence and sort of strengthening infrastructure. And we know from Pete Hegseth's comments to Richard Marles at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore at the end of May, I believe, that the American position to us has been to say, well, we think you should lift your spending to about 3.5% of GDP. Now, in one sense, I think it's regrettable that we have to be told that by the Americans because, as you know, the book we published argued for 3% well before that came out.
3% by the end of this term of
government. By the end of this term.
Yeah.
Which would be a very rapid ramp up. But there's virtually, outside of government circles, there's virtually no one saying that the current level of defence spending is adequate. So I think the Americans are going to continue down this line. And, with regard to the AUKUS review, no one expects that out of that is going to come a conclusion which says, you know what, Australia, we've been looking at how you spend that money and you're spending it so brilliantly that you alone of all our friends only need to spend 2% of gross domestic product on defence. I'm here to tell you, breaking news, Scott, that is not going to be the outcome of this American review. No. They are going to continue to press us to spend more. The Prime Minister has now dug himself very firmly into a trench which says that's not going to happen. Then the next element of that will be, will the Americans be prepared to sell us those second-hand Virginia-class nuclear submarines, which are kind of an interim step between what we have now and the future AUKUS class, which is being designed by the British. They're the ones we're supposed to be building in Adelaide in the 30s and 40s. But the interim solution is 3, 4, or 5 Virginia-class nuclear submarines. And I think a highly likely outcome here is that the Americans will say, these submarines are in such short supply that we feel we just can't provide them to you, Australia. If you can't give us more confidence that you're really with us. And that's not about committing to a war in Taiwan. It's just about saying, are we part of the alliance framework in the Pacific? And so I think there's going to be, I think that's probably where the Americans will end up. And then, how will Albanese play it? Well, on the one hand, that would clearly be a failure of the Albanese government, a major failure, because as I say, they've had 80% of the life of AUKUS to manage it. So that's not a good outcome. On the other hand, the political driver will be to sort of stand on his hind legs and say, well, we're a strong Australia, we're sovereign, no one's going to push us around and tell us what to do, apart from Beijing. And so, sorry, Americans, but if that's how you want to play it, then too bad, so sad.
Yes.
But we lose from that.
We do.
And the Americans lose from that.
And we of course, are in fervent agreement that it is our sovereign call, how much we spend on defence, but we have been saying it needs to be more. And of course there are, and we might sort of make these concluding remarks, but I mean there are defence and national security analysts in Australia who have, from what you might call a good place, said that all nuclear submarines are not the best use of limited resources, and we should be spending it on conventional military resources. And certainly we've talked about other the mines, missiles, and drones, the hardening of our northern defences, the B-21s, the F-35Bs. Correct me if I'm wrong, and various other very, very important investments that we believe should be made. But this is what I've taken out of this interview, Peter, and I do thank you for your time, is that there is a third option, which is where we neither spend the money on AUKUS nor do we spend it on conventional military means. We simply don't spend anything at all, and we have the New Zealandification of Australia.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I guess lightly armed neutrality is indeed a policy stance that Australia could take. The risk, of course, with that is that we will find ourselves, forever being pushed around by China as the regional great power in ways which I think are not going to sit well with average Australians. Nevertheless, I think it potentially could be an endpoint of government policy if they really mess this up, which frankly they're doing an outstanding job of messing these things up. So, what's needed now, I think, is some urgent internal consideration inside government about, is this really what we want? Can we afford to do this? There's got to be some contemplations of fallback positions if the Americans are going to change their mind about those Virginia nuclear boats. And we've got to get real about understanding China, that it is not the benign partner that Anthony Albanese tells us that it is. It's interesting, 10 years ago, sorry, and I'll finish on this point, Scott, but 10 years ago, business was way out ahead of government, thinking that it wanted to get into, the endless market that was China. Right now, government is way ahead of business. And you pointed to the fact that, in fact, a lot of Australian businesses are actually now reducing their footprint in China. They're working as hard as they can to diversify their markets. It's only a small number of Australian businesses, principally the big extractors and our universities, which want to double down on the single relationship and pretend that politics doesn't play a role. So business is now more cautious, and it's the government going back to a sort of a pre-COVID moment of rivers of gold opportunities in defence cooperation, paying no attention to what everyone keeps saying is the worst strategic outlook that we've had since the end of the Second World War. It's frankly, the government's position is just bizarre, but nevertheless, here we are.
But here we are, and perhaps on a future podcast, we might bring in some member of the economics team to ask the questions about whether those rivers of gold will in fact continue to flow as well, because it's a big bet on China's economic future, and there is a lot of informed views out there that it is unsustainable because you heard it here first at the IPA. Eventually, communism's internal contradictions come to the fore, and the whole thing falls apart.
Which may well be the moment that Xi Jinping decides that war is the last recourse to sustain the position of the Communist Party, war and nationalism, when all else has failed, when they can't deliver on their economic promises. So it's actually the risk of China's failure rather than its ongoing success, which I think gives rise to the greatest prospects for a conflict in the region.
There's a bracing thought. Peter Jennings, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Scott.